a portrait of Jacinda Ardern. But the more research I did, the more I decided that it really couldn't just be about her. It had to be about her in context. And so that's why it's called Jacinda Ardern in Context. I wanted to know what she was doing to change conditions and how that was working out. I used the internet for my research, which led me beyond Wikipedia and the Encyclopedia Britannica to lots of newspaper articles. The Guardian was my main critical source, but I also read many New Zealand press accounts. I had to learn a lot because I don't know that much about politics and especially not much about economics. But fortunately, Carol Clark really helped me understand things. Another thing that the poster said that someone took offense to is that she was the youngest prime minister in the world. And I just want to say that she was the youngest prime minister in the world from 2017 when she was appointed until 2019 when the Finns, I believe, appointed Sanna Marin. I don't know if I'm saying her name right. She's about, I don't know, 6 years younger than Jacinda Ardern. Okay, I'm going to start with New Zealand, actually. Before I start with New Zealand, I just wanted to mention some words, which I will refer to. Kiwi, that's a common self-reference term used by New Zealanders for themselves. Just recently, I mentioned something about Kiwis and somebody said, what? And then the first settlers of New Zealand were the Maoris. The English pronunciation is Maori, but the Maoris roll their R's. I can't roll my R's, so sometimes I say Maori, but usually I'll say Maori because I can't do justice. And the Marae, again, there would be a rolled R here. It's the Maori communal and sacred meeting place. Okay. New Zealand is right down here in the right corner, and it's 26 miles from Australia, and it's a 5-hour plane ride. Long ago, I had the two kind of joined in my mind, only distinguishing New Zealand by its sheep and its first settlers, the Maoris. New Zealand consists of 2 islands, North Island and South Island, as well as a lot of nearby small islands. The population is only 5 million people. It's 70% white, 16% Maori, 15% Asian, and 9% other Pacific Islanders. In terms of history, it's got a unique ecosystem because New Zealand split off from the supercontinent of Gondwana first, pursuing its own evolutionary path. So there are no original mammals there except for marine mammals and bats, and it has extremely unusual and beautiful flora. There's a lot of volcanic activity, especially evident on the North Island, but also on the South Island, where there was a huge earthquake in Christchurch in 2010. Running down the middle of the South Island and also in the southern part of the North Island are high mountains. The South Island, there are also glaciers, and they're fertile plains, which makes it good for agriculture. As I mentioned, the Maoris were the first settlers. They were Pacific Islanders from Eastern Polynesia who arrived in their canoes in the late 1200s. Probably they visited before then because archaeologists have found rat bones that are older than the Maori bones that they found, but there's pretty much good consensus that the Maoris came then. The original culture involved cannibalism, polygamy, and a lot of trading and warfare. So there were tribes and they fought with each other. They settled the North Island very well, and they built a lot of fortifications for warfare. The first European to sail by was a Dutchman, Abel Tasman. in 1642 who was looking for the great southern continent. He claimed it for the Dutch, but they never settled. Then Captain Cook sighted it and mapped it in 1769 and claimed it for the British. The first settlers were missionaries, whalers, and sealers. They had lots of contact with the Maoris and traded with them. They taught them how to raise potatoes and pigs, which turned out to be a very positive contribution, but they fueled intertribal warfare by selling the Maoris guns. They also spread infectious diseases, mainly the measles and the flu. The population in 1840 was between 70 and 90,000, but by the beginning of the 20th century, there were only 50,000 left. I found out when I was visiting that the Maoris were good business persons, and some of them developed a guiding industry in the middle of the 1800s, whereby Europeans traveled to New Zealand and toured volcanic sites with their Maori guides. In 1840, the British introduced the Treaty of Waitangi. They translated into Maori and took it all around the country, so 500 chiefs signed it. In the Maori language version, the word sovereignty was interpreted very differently by them. The Maoris believed they were just giving permission to the British to use their land. And the Brits believed that it gave them complete sovereignty over the Maori, their land and their resources. Disputes over land ownership led to 20 years of warfare in various parts of the North Island. Finally, the British Crown was victorious, although the Maoris really gave them a fight for their money. Land confiscation and questionable land sales carried on into the 20th century until the vast majority of land in New Zealand was owned by the settlers and the Crown. Thus, most rights guaranteed to the Maori by the treaty were ignored. The Waitangi Tribunal was set up in 1975, and it has ruled on a number of claims brought by the Maori iwi or tribes, and in many cases, compensation has been granted. Maori electorates were established in 1867. All male Maoris over 21 were given the right to vote if they owned property, which of course, mostly property was communally owned. And they were given 4 seats in Parliament when they really deserved probably 14 to 16 seats. The Maori landowners who lived in European electorates could vote there. The British did this partly to bring the Maoris into the government, but mainly to reward those who had fought with the British. And even though it was seen as something temporary, it still exists until today, and the Maoris actually mostly want it. Since 1967, Maori candidates could run for seats in European districts. The colonists did not believe in the sacredness or purpose of the Maori language, which is called Te Reo. This resulted in a ban of the language in many schools and communities. The English considered speaking Te Reo as disrespectful and would punish school children, including caning them publicly. Maoris were forbidden to teach traditional medicinal uses of native plants. Even in the 1980s, many still discouraged Te Reo and suppressed it in the community. However, as of 1987, Te Reo became an official language. Not surprisingly, throughout the 19th and much of the 20th century, the homeland of Britain had an enormous influence on the nature of New Zealand's government administration, education, and culture. New Zealand troops fought and suffered severe casualties in the Boer War and the 2 World Wars, including at Gallipoli. And I went to an exhibit on Gallipoli at the National Museum in Wellington, and it was interesting. It said that the Turks were absolutely terrified by the Maori regiment, probably partly because they would do the haka, their war dance in the beginning, and stick out their tongues, and that freaked them out. In 1893, there was universal suffrage. I think it was the first country that allowed women to vote, including the Maoris. After World War II, cultural ties with Britain, whoops. Sorry, wasn't expecting that. Cultural ties with Great Britain remained strong, but successive New Zealand governments saw the US as their major ally and protector, and they joined the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization and signed the ANZUS Pact. New Zealand troops also fought with US forces during the Korean and the Vietnam Wars. The country now has its own strong sense of identity. While still a member of the British Commonwealth and maintaining close and friendly relations with the US, New Zealand now has a far more independent trading and foreign policy. Since the mid-1980s, New Zealand has been a nuclear-free zone, with its armed forces primarily focused on peacekeeping in the Pacific region. And China is a major trading partner. In 1993, New Zealand transitioned to proportional representation in Parliament. Uh-oh. You know, I'm going to have to pause a second because my battery is dying. I'll be right back. Clearly, this is not a very professional presentation. Okay, proportional representation. So when you vote, you cast two votes. One is for your party, and one is for whoever is running for a position. Each party creates a list of individuals whom they would like to see in Parliament. And these MPs are not elected, but appointed to make the proportion represent the voters. This corrected past abuses, and I think an example will help make it clear. For example, a party called the Social Credit Party was a victim of disproportionality. They won 16% of the vote in 1978, but they only won one seat in Parliament. So by this system, they would have gotten 16% of the seats in Parliament, and they would have been filled from their list. And those members of Parliament who come from the list are called the list MPs. Okay, while urban dwelling has become increasingly common, there's a sizable rural population, and farming is a major export earner. And there are farming families that are extremely wealthy. The traditional exports of wool, meat, and dairy products still continue, but new products, including New Zealand venison, also known as cervina, flowers, fruit, biotechnology, and wine do very well. And I passed a farm where they were raising deer, venison, and I just thought that was great. So they rounded up all the deer that had been brought there and were probably pretty destructive and turned them into agricultural product. Okay, now I'm going to talk about Jacinda Ardern. She was born in 1980 in Hamilton, which is on the North Island, sort of central, slightly west. She grew up in an isolated small town, Murupara, which was 90% Maori, and it wasn't a tribal area. And then in Morrinsville, a small town on the North Island, in the midst of the dairy farming region. Her father was a policeman. Her mother was a catering assistant in the school cafeteria. And I think she said she was also a bookkeeper. She had one sister, and the family were Mormon. The girls went to public schools, government schools, and as a teenager, her first job was in a fish and chip shop. In 1999, at age 17, she became involved in politics. Her aunt, a labor activist, Marie Ardern, recruited her to help campaign for a candidate. She also said that she was motivated by a desire to end child poverty, which she had witnessed as she grew up. She attended Warrensville College, where she served on the board of directors as student representative, and Waikato University as a politics, public relations, and communications major. She spent one semester at Arizona State University and graduated from Waikato in 2001. And I also wanted to mention this Arizona State University business. When I was in Wellington, I stayed with my friend Chris's sister-in-law, who's a deputy ambassador, US ambassador to New Zealand. And she's a career, civil servant, State Department civil servant. And she's very proud of the State Department. I was there in 2019 and very upset about Trump and not wanting to see anything positive about this country. But she said that one thing that State Department did that she's proud of is they looked for local talent, and they saw Jacinda Ardern and they sent her on for more education. So I'm assuming that was the reason she went to Arizona State. She joined the youth branch of the Labor Party, quickly became a senior figure, then was elected president of the International Socialist Party in 2008 and traveled throughout the world on its behalf. Also, after college, she held various government jobs in New Zealand and in the United Kingdom, and at one point worked in a New York City soup kitchen and on a workers' rights campaign. Her formal political career began in 2008. She returned from New Zealand from London to campaign unsuccessfully for a seat, but she was appointed as a Labour Party list MP and became the youngest sitting MP in 2008. She remained in Parliament thanks to the list, despite losing more district elections. She was Labour's spokesperson for youth and associate spokesperson for justice. During the National Party's government, she was shadow spokesperson for justice, small business, children, and arts and culture. Then in 2017, she had a stupendous year. First, in March, she was unanimously elected deputy leader of the Labour Party. And a few months later, Andrew Little, the Labour Prime Minister, who was quite unpopular, stepped down, and she was elected as party leader and was unopposed. And then when the election came, there was a landslide victory for the Labour Party. And many people think her victory was fueled by her looks and youth, because she and her predecessor had the same views, but he was not popular. The Labour Party got a lot of donations. Then 80 days after becoming the leader of the Labour Party, she became the prime minister, sworn in October 2017 by Governor General Patsy Reddy. She was the third female prime minister and the third female leader of the Labour Party. And she promised that her government would be focused, empathic, and strong. Just a few personal notes about her. She left the Mormon church in her early 20s. She was living with some roommates who were gay, and she felt that going to church on her part was very hypocritical. She now considers herself an agnostic. Her partner is Clark Gayford, who has a TV show on fishing and is the main caregiver for their child, Neve, who was born in 2018. She was a second head of government who was given birth in office. They are engaged, and I recently read that their wedding had to be canceled because of COVID. So now I'm gonna shift gears a little bit here and show you a videotape, part of a videotape. She was awarded a prize at at the Harvard Kennedy School, and went there to get the prize and to make a speech. And then she was interviewed by some of the students, and I wanted to play you some of the interview to give you a sense of her and a sense of what she cares about. Here we go. Whoops, that didn't work, sorry. No, lost it. Okay.
For me, it's actually real simplicity. The reason I...
Oops, go back a little bit. Okay.
About the changes in the world, but we're going to start with Maynard from the college. And Maynard, if you'll unmute yourself and put your video on and ask your question briefly so we can get lots of questions. Maynard.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Sherman. Hi, Prime Minister Ardern. My name is Manat Banassi. I'm a junior at Harvard College. Thanks so much for your awesome words on leadership. I would just love to know my questions about what inspires you and what motivates you. Thank you so much.
Manat, thank you. I'll try and keep this very, very brief. I think, for me, it's actually real simplicity. The reason I spoke to the COVID response for us being driven by people is because ultimately that's what's brought me to politics. I was never motivated by the idea of personal position. When I joined the Labour Party, I thought that I would probably continue on as a volunteer, delivering leaflets over the course of my life. And probably that is how I will finish in politics. And so my presence in politics has always been because I've seen it as a powerful tool for change for the betterment of people. I believe in equality. I believe in making sure that people have all of the opportunities that their potential should offer. I believe in children not living in poverty when you live in a prosperous nation. And I've always believed politics can change those things. So that's why I delivered leaflets. It's why I said yes to the opportunity to come into Parliament. And it's why I am the Child Poverty Reduction Minister as well. That is my inspiration, is continuing to improve people's lives through politics, particularly our children. Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is Corey from the Harvard Kennedy School. Corey, if you'll unmute yourself, go ahead.
Kia ora, Prime Minister. It's really great to meet you.
Kia ora.
My name is Corey Tahera, and I am a 2019 HKS Master in Public Policy alum, hailing from West Auckland, New Zealand, currently living in Washington, DC. So if you make it over to DC to meet President-elect Biden anytime, hit me up. I'd love to say hello in person. My question to you is this. In recent years, New Zealand has been judged to have some of the lowest levels of corruption and some of the highest levels of public confidence in the political process in the world. Despite this, my fear is that the emergence of a professional political class and sophisticated lobbying industry, in addition to our arguably out-of-date campaign finance laws, is a perfect combination of factors that could begin to see our democracy fall victim to big money interests who wield increasing political power. In light of this, what reforms to domestic campaign finance and lobbying laws will your government push for in its current term? And how much of a priority are these reforms for you, given everything else you have on your plate right now? Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Corey. Thank you for the question. I think probably what I'm about to tell an American audience will astound them in terms of our relative campaign finance laws in contrast to the United States. So many people may not know, Corey obviously does, that we have spending limits in our electorate seats and our constituencies when we individually campaign to be MPs of $25,000. And so that is designed to make it accessible. That means that, that you can be a school teacher and run a political campaign and not be outdone by someone who has more access to greater resource. And so that's something that is very, very important to us. But as Corey rightly points out, we have, of course, the ability to receive donations as political parties. We have to declare those. We have to make them public. We've just recently banned basically foreign donations, but I do think there's more to do because you're right, Corey, it's about preserving our position as being free of corruption and constantly being willing to analyse whether or not our finance laws are achieving those goals and keeping public confidence. So already I've just recently was looking at some papers from our team to start a process across all of our parliament to look at what we might need to change around our electoral finance legislation to maintain that confidence in our system. So I want that to be a cross-party piece of work. We should all support it, be committed to it, make sure that we're retaining public confidence. And in this term of office, I do want our campaign finance laws to be a focus of our attention for reform because I think it's needed.
Great, thank you so much. Next is Tracy, who is a board member of the Taubman Center. Tracy.
Good evening, Prime Minister. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tracy Zen, and I'm president for Zipcar and also a board member at the Taubman Center. My question for you is, you introduced the world's first well-being budget last year, focusing on mental illness, child poverty, and family violence. New Zealand is the first Western country to design its entire budget around well-being priorities and instruct its ministries to design policies for the well-being of its citizens. Can you please share with us what drove this initiative and what outcomes, if the outcomes are tracking to your expectations?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. And, the reason we did that was quite simple. And it's actually the same reason that and I'm going to perhaps not quote it exactly correctly, but the statement that was first coined in the United States, that GDP measures everything except that which matters most. And that was the reason we did this. As with many Western democracies, the tools with which the public, the media, institutions tend to judge the success or otherwise of a nation are so heavily focused on economic measures. And as many of you on the call know and appreciate, GDP is such a crude tool. You could be demonstrating significant growth as an economy, but at the same time have devastating levels of youth suicide, homelessness, and environmental degradation. And in fact, when we came to office, that was exactly what New Zealand was experiencing. We'd been described as a rock star economy, particularly as we came through the aftermath of the GFC. But all of those other well-being markers were frankly markers of shame for us as a nation. So we wanted to shift the discourse towards how do we measure and therefore prioritise within our usual budgetary processes through our machinery of government a well-being lens. And that's why we have within our Treasury a living standards framework. So that means that we analyse our spending decisions in a different way. And it's also why we have a requirement that as part of our budget, we must report on child poverty progress and how many children have been lifted out of poverty and will be by our budget initiatives, because we're trying to shift the measure of success away from those traditional tools that do not tell the full story. To be honest, Tracy, until though the discourse changes, until we value other measures, not just as politicians, but as society, it's not necessarily something we'll sustain beyond a political cycle. So I'm thinking now more of how do we widen the dialogue around what matters to us and what's important to us.
Okay. So can people see I'm back with my slideshow?
Yes.
It's visible. Okay. Okay. So I wanted to look at Ardern's balance sheet. You know, I think no one would disagree with me that she's very charismatic, bright, attractive. You know, you just love her. But what has she really been able to do? And also, what I struggled with is how to separate COVID. I mean, it ended up that I give her maybe a C-, but how much of that has to do with COVID? How much of that has to do with big money interests? How much does that have to do with entrenched problems that have been there for years? So those are questions in my mind. I also wanted to make a comment on the second interview question in particular. There are big problems in New Zealand around party donations. And in fact, I think in 2020, there were a scandal both in the Labour Party involving the Deputy Prime Minister and in the Nationalist Party, which is the big opposition party, about donations. So that's an issue that has to be solved. She doesn't mention lobbying, but apparently lobbying is really unregulated there. And members of parliament can be a lobbyist one day and be negotiating for something the next day. And so that is probably an interference. Okay, I think she's been really, really good in terms of national disasters. So in 2019, in March, there was, 51 people were murdered and dozens were injured when an Australian man walked into a mosque and just shot all these people dead. She met with the survivors in the Muslim community wearing a hijab, and she refused to speak the name of the assassin. Now, it wasn't just this, but immediately strict gun laws were introduced, banning most semi-automatic weapons, and the law was passed very quickly. Less complicated, but her empathy was clear. There was a volcanic eruption on White Island, leaving 17 people dead. It's actually a private island, and I think most of the people who died were tourists. In terms of COVID, her style could be characterized as compassionate and clear. The messages she gives out are sober and soothing. She had weekly Facebook Live chats. I don't actually know what that is, but maybe the rest of you do. I assume it's where people can participate in real time. She used a lot of helpful common sense concepts like, just don't go far from home. What if your car breaks down? Or act as if you have COVID when relating to people outside your bubble. She supplied good information. She never shifted blame. She emphasized kindness. She tried to manage expectations. She held a press conference especially for children, which corresponds to her strong interest in children. And she took a 20% salary reduction sort of to express her solidarity with people who are suffering. The initial response from public health and the government was an early lockdown and border closing and widespread testing. because subsequently they had very few cases. They focused on eradication. Lockdown was really damaging to the economy, and they were quite slow to introduce vaccinations. Only 9.2% were vaccinated by July 2021 and 50% by October, when New Zealand realized that eradication was not going to work. And I believe that they have had another lockdown recently because they're having a big problem with Omicron. Okay, I'm going to move on to the Labour Party's 3 goals, which were to decrease child poverty, deal with the housing crisis, and decrease social inequality. I'm going to start with child poverty. UNICEF has repeatedly given New Zealand low ratings because of child poverty, suicide, and obesity. In fact, they rank them 35 among 41 high-income countries. Ardern has argued with this. She doesn't think that their data is up to date, but in New Zealand, the data doesn't look so great. However, in her newly created role as Minister for Child Poverty Reduction, she introduced legislation in 2018 to create political accountability for reduction targets, sorry. They also created something called the Family Package in 2018, which included paid parental leave, gradually increased to 26 weeks, $60 a week universal payment for low and middle income families with young children, an increase in the family tax credit, the orphans benefit, accommodation supplement, and foster care allowance. Also, they started a pilot school lunch program and then extended it to 200,000 children in low income schools. Okay, what have been the results? The benefits have been slow and inadequate. As The Guardian reported in May, they said progress is moving at a, quote, glacial pace, with many vulnerable children still living in damp, unaffordable homes and in families that run out of food. More children than ever are living in motels as a public housing waiting list has soared. I believe it went to, well, let me see if I can find it. In 2016, 4,000 people were on the public housing list. And more recently, 20,000 people have been on the public housing lists. Across numerous categories, the data has been divided among racial lines, with Maori and Pacific Island children experiencing much worse outcomes. The rates of Maori and Pacific Island children living in homes that ran out of food often or sometimes were 30% for the Maori and 46% for the Pacific Islanders. Overall, 20% of children faced that kind of food insecurity. Maori children were also represented in referrals for Child Protective Service investigations and had double the rate of attempting suicide. It was hard to tell if this is an overall downward trend and how much it's been impacted by COVID. I'm going to go on to the housing crisis. The homelessness rate is very high. It's 1%, and no one really believes me that the US rate is just 0.2%. But I have to say that when I was in Auckland, there were lots of people sleeping in the street. And I was told that anyone who had a service job in Auckland had to live on the street or live in their car. But New Zealand's 10-year housing crisis worsened dramatically since the pandemic, with ultra low interest rates and a faster than anticipated economic recovery, compounding pre-existing issues of affordability and supply. Many Kiwis returned home because of the initial low incidence of COVID. In Wellington, the median house price has now gone up 35% in a year. Recently, the national median house price rose by nearly 23% in a year. Also, there's a lot of really poor housing stock. A lot of people are living in leaky, damp, really below standard kind of housing. Well, I looked into what causes this problem, and I found a number of reasons. It's an island nation with little affordable land, and most of the land has restrictive covenants or covenants that restrict design and minimum size. And these have been put in place by developers to raise their profits. The housing market has progressively tilted toward constructions of large, expensive homes on very small, expensive lots, which take forever to build. The local planning process for building affordable homes is hijacked by neighbors, personal agendas, and NIMBYism. Of course, this sounds very familiar to all of us. Housing construction has also been limited by something called the Resource Management Act, which is weighted against new projects and is highly restricted. Fortunately, a government review was done concluding that the current act could not cope with the high population growth, diminishing biodiversity, degradation of nature, and the need to mitigate and adapt to climate change. And the report recommended principally the repeal and replacement of the act. So how has the Ardern administration dealt with the housing crisis? Well, first they passed a law in 2018 banning foreign investment in real estate. And when I was there, I was told that that was a problem, that all these Americans and Chinese people were buying up apartments and they were leaving them vacant so they flipped them. But in fact, foreigners only account for 3% of the real estate investors, although they're more concentrated in high price areas. They closed tax loopholes that investors took advantage of, such as being able to deduct mortgage interest payments. And now that this has been disallowed among investors, and they're applying it to existing property owners. More financial aid was made available to first-time home buyers. They promised to construct more affordable housing. This sounded really good to me, with a big project called Kiwi Build that would construct 100,000 affordable houses by 2028. Ardern also asked the National Bank to consider their interest rates in light of the housing crisis. And in February 2021, the government confirmed that the Resource Management Act would be scrapped and replaced by 3 separate acts that deal with climate, environment, and strategic planning. The acts are to be drafted, notified, and implemented over the next 3 years. What were the results? Well, the ban on foreign real estate investors had very little impact because they really didn't own much property. The attempt to help first-time buyers was not useful because prices just kept rising and rising, and they still couldn't afford to buy. Because wages are rising very little in contrast to housing prices. The attempt to build new housing failed because of infrastructure problems in 2019. The closing of loopholes was met by the opposition party, who insisted that landlords would be increasing their rents to make up for their losses. Although they did the government was giving exemptions for social housing arrangements such as habitat. The vast majority of Kiwi adults continue to have no investment property and are disadvantaged by skyrocketing prices. They can't move up the ladder because it would mean taking on more debt, and Maoris have it far worse. This suggests an increasing wealthy property investor class has developed. There are possibilities such as using government land to build affordable housing, building more appropriate housing stock, such as townhouses or clustered housing, to address the imbalance in ownership, The government has recently announced a shared ownership scheme to help families who don't have enough money for a deposit. Things like Habitat, such as Habitat. Okay, moving on to the last issue, which is social inequality. So the GDP in New Zealand increased 35% between 1982 and 2011, but the benefits went to the richest people. And this was exacerbated by the financial crisis of 2008. As of 2019, the top 5% of the population owns 38% of the wealth, while half the population makes less than $24,000 a year. What has Ardern done? Well, first I'm going to talk about her relationship with the Maori community. And this shows her empathy initially. She traveled to Waitangi in 2018 for the annual Waitangi Day commemoration. She stayed for 5 days, which is an unprecedented length, and she became the first female prime minister to speak from the top marae, which is a sacred meeting ground. Her visit was very well received by Maori leaders, noting a sharp contrast with the acrimonious responses received by several of her predecessors. In fact, I heard that when Queen Elizabeth went there, somebody threw a Maori t-shirt in her face. Ardern has not returned to Waitangi, despite saying she wanted to be held accountable to lift Maori children out of poverty, to create more jobs, and to reduce incarceration rates for Maoris. She did appoint a Maori woman as foreign minister, but the Maoris make up 50% of the prison population. Remember, they're only 16% of the national population and 65% of children in care. They're overrepresented in terms of poor health and mortality outcomes, poverty, homelessness, drug and alcohol addiction. Ardern has refused to get involved in Maori issues. For example, there was an occupation by Maori activists to reclaim tribal land from private property developers. Also, another issue is the removal of Maori infants from their mothers, and police armed response teams which disproportionately target Maori communities. However, some legislation was introduced to combat social inequality. There was an expansion of free doctor visits, steady increases in the minimum wage, something called the Provincial Growth Fund to invest in rural infrastructure projects. The first year of post-secondary education was made free. They increased teachers' pay, and they canceled the National Party's promised tax cuts to invest in health and education. On the other hand, Ardern has been strictly lukewarm about the Green Party proposal for a tax on wealth over 1 million. When it comes to the most unequally distributed forms of wealth, such as trusts, shares, bonds, and direct ownership of companies, Ardern's labor-led government has shown little appetite for redistribution. Over 1/3 of businesses are actively being run by descendants of the fortune's originator, with the number of family members passively receiving the proceeds of that wealth undoubtedly higher still. While some rich people are entrepreneurs developing new products, fortunes made in finance, insurance, and real estate are predominant. More than half the country's ultra-wealthy individuals, those with over 50 million, declare less than $70,000, an implausibly low figure. They avoid taxes by taking their income as untaxed capital gains, undervaluing the services they provide to their own companies, and transferring wealth to charities which they control but make little or no charitable donations, just like Trump. This distribution is a particular problem in a country with a legacy of settler colonialism. And one of the questions for economic historians is if hiding behind the masking language of averages, medians, and percentages, we have quietly witnessed one of the biggest increases in inequality for indigenous populations in generations. While we now can begin to piece together the story of how the response to one crisis has created another, the key issue is whether this rapidly increasing inequality will become a problem similarly worthy of urgent policy attention. Well, I'm going to stop here and ask people if they have questions or comments. Yes.
Unmute yourself, Helen.
So, or Sunny, I've got my name wrong.
Right.
So,
I know your
so
name.
Helen, this is fascinating. As you know, I spent time in
I
New
know.
Zealand, but it was back in 1998, and my main focus was on education policy. And the world was very different then. Just a couple of things. When Ted Fisk and I were looking at education policy, we talked a lot about the Maori and who were being, people were treating them reasonably well and trying to set up new systems. But there were also the whole group of Pacific Islanders.
Right.
And I missed the first 10 minutes of your talk today. And I just wondered if you talked about them and what their status is. Because when we were looking at disadvantaged students, we spent a lot of time looking not only at the Maori, but Pacific Islanders. The other thing that was relevant 25 years ago was, and when we were there in 1998, and 10 years prior to that, New Zealand had been left the European common market had its relationship with England had changed dramatically because of the common market. So England had played an important role in supporting the economy by buying all the lamb from New Zealand and in lots of other ways. So then New Zealand was left on its own, and there was a big push in the 1990s to try to become more efficient, because they had to have the private sector more efficient, and then they tried to make the education more efficiency. There was this huge emphasis coming from right-wing economists in the US and elsewhere. And so there were trade-offs there. And I didn't hear you say, I mean, I don't know where that is now, whether they're, what the orientation is. And then just one final point, you came up with an explanation of why Ardern went to Arizona, but our conclusion was everybody tried to spend a year away from New Zealand. Okay. Here they were out in the middle of nowhere, and the standard policy for everybody now, where they decided to go, I don't know, but that was just very standard.
Okay. So let's see. Now tell me the first one again.
Pacific Islanders.
Oh yeah.
So, and there's a different name for them now. I
Pacifica.
Think. Pacifica.
Wait, that's not right. Pacific.
Something like that.
I wrote it down somewhere. Okay, they're in worse shape, way worse shape than the Maoris. No, they are in terms of poverty.
Yeah, so that's cool. Relevant for thinking about this. The Maori have been, unlike African Americans here, the Maori have been respected and brought into the government and whatever. That doesn't mean they're still not poor, but it's a very different situation.
Well, it's not as different as you think. I went through the history, and the ones that they included, they created these Maori electorates, and the ones that the British wanted in there were the ones that supported them against the rest of the Maoris. And they had way fewer seats in government than they should have had. And even into the 80s, the language was considered I mean, they beat kids publicly for speaking the language in the 60s.
But I understand that, and that was clearly
Yeah.
the case, and it was
I mean,
in
it's
opposition to the
changed a lot. It's changed a lot.
but it's changed a lot, and that's my point.
Yeah,
And
no,
even
I
when we were
agree.
there, it had changed.
I agree, but they're still really poor, you know. Did the rest of you see that movie, Boy?
Yeah, we
The
couldn't
New
understand
Zealand
it.
Oh, well,
because we
anyway,
didn't have the words.
poverty was very, very evident there. I'm just-
And but that was in rural areas, so
that
when
was in
Ted and I
rural
were-
areas.
yeah,
Yeah,
we were
But I
focusing on
I think,
education.
okay. Pacifica, they're called, PASIFIKA.
Right.
So food insecurity, 30% for Maori, 46% for Pacifica families, for example. So, you know, they're in really bad shape. Okay, now remind me of your questions. So,
Well, I just referred to the loss of the market links with England.
okay,
And so then
yeah,
there was a lot of focus
Right.
on, and it was the National Party that was really promoting this efficiency and self.
well, I didn't really come across that too much, but they have economically, the country has done really well. And they have very successful exports. So they're managing to sell the traditional things like wool and dairy products and lamb. And they also have a bunch of new products like wine and venison.
Yeah.
And let's see. Anyway, so
But that's interesting. The economy has done well. When
economy has done really well. Okay. Yeah. Stuart.
Stuart, you're muted.
Yeah, my experience in New Zealand is about the same time as Sunny's, about a little more than 20 years ago. It was more with the economy, and at that time we were trying to create networks of companies to get into trade together to expand their trade. And I was working, in fact, with one a network broker for white wines, trying to export them. But I also was looking at the education through the lens of the community college system, which was much more trying to get people into the, into the labor force. And there were some colleges that were dealing directly, overwhelmingly with Maori populations. But I was wondering whether they're getting into those colleges for the skilled labor, but whether instead of the paths that led them into professional occupations, are they represented now in the labor force and the higher level occupations in New Zealand?
Well, yeah, I don't really know that. We had tour guides who were Maori, a Maori woman and a Pacific Islander woman, but I don't really know. Both, seem very intelligent and well educated, but I didn't look at that. So I can't answer your question. Maggie.
I am struck by Ahern's youth and a possible parallel to what has been happening in the United States, where experience and the value placed on experience seems to have gone out of fashion. And it's no longer so important when either party sorts candidates to look at the depth of their experience. And much as I love Obama, I think he would have been a far better and effective president had he had, say, 10 more years of experience in the Senate or somewhere else. And I look at Ahern and her youth and her distinction as being such a young prime minister, and wonder if we see the same trends in New Zealand in terms of the disregarding of experience in the context of choosing candidates.
I agree with you. I mean, to think of where she was and how quickly she rose to the top, sort of astounding. And, you know, she hasn't had that much life experience except in politics. I mean, maybe that's okay, but yeah, I agree with you. She's like a star, you know.
Yes.
He was a star too. I mean,
Yes.
they're both good stars. but
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any other thoughts or questions? Nope.
Well, well,
Thank you for doing this again.
Yeah.
Oh, you're
For
welcome.
those of us.
Did it. Oh,
You may
Thanks.
want to suggest to women's studies that they try to record, because I think it's often
Yeah.
difficult for people to get to the talks at the right time and the right day.
I think we've been convinced of that now.
Okay, good.
Some of them haven't turned out, you know, some of them have been failures, but I think maybe that's getting better. So, yeah.
But I think if you can get the professional staff to do it, that, and as long as you're doing
Well,
things
we
during
don't
the
do
day. Hmm?
Yeah, we asked Brian. We don't
Yeah.
do it.
Yes, daytime people are pretty secure. I think the evening is harder.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well,
Well, thank you.
thank you.
Thanks.
It's
for
really
coming.
interesting, Helen.
Right.
And-
Very interesting.
I'm stopping the recording and then I'm ending.